The world did not shift overnight, but tonight, it is openly realigning in plain sight. A quiet but historic rupture is unfolding across global diplomacy, and at the center of it stands the United States under President Donald Trump, increasingly treated not as the anchor of international order, but as its most unpredictable variable. Across multiple continents, a pattern is emerging with unusual clarity. Leaders are no longer waiting for Washington to stabilize its position. Instead, they are building parallel frameworks of cooperation, security arrangements, economic partnerships, and diplomatic channels that increasingly operate outside traditional American leadership. From Paris, President Emmanuel Macron is exploring coalition-based maritime security structures. From Beijing, President Xi Jinping is expanding strategic dialogue with Arab states and positioning China as a long-term stabilizing partner. In Madrid, Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez is accelerating technological and diplomatic engagement with China, while reinforcing Europe's strategic autonomy. And in Kyiv, President Volodymyr Zelensky is actively shaping new security partnerships that extend far beyond Europe's traditional boundaries. Individually, these moves may appear incremental. Together, they signal something far more significant: the gradual construction of a post-American coordination system, not in opposition to Washington, but in anticipation of its unpredictability. At the center of this shift is a growing perception problem. Under Trump, U.S. foreign policy is increasingly viewed as inconsistent, reactive, and personality-driven. Allies describe a system where commitments can shift rapidly, where diplomatic messaging is often overshadowed by personal grievance, and where long-term strategy is difficult to distinguish from short-term political performance. That perception, whether fully fair or politically contested, is reshaping behavior in real time. Even institutions historically aligned with Western leadership are adjusting their tone. The Vatican under Pope Leo XIV is reportedly dismissing political intimidation and reframing its role strictly around humanitarian and moral authority, further underscoring a widening gap between symbolic global leadership and state-driven geopolitical coordination. Meanwhile, China is not forcing this transition, it is absorbing it. By projecting stability, patience, and continuity, Beijing is positioning itself as the preferred counterpart for states seeking predictability in an increasingly fragmented international system. This is not a declared realignment. It is a functional one. It is happening through meetings, partnerships, and strategic hedging rather than formal announcements. And that makes it more consequential, because it reflects structural behavior, not political rhetoric. Tonight's breaking story is not a single crisis, but a slow erosion of assumption. The assumption that Washington automatically leads, that alliances are fixed, and that global order is anchored permanently in American stability. That assumption is now under visible strain. And as that strain spreads, one question is beginning to define the geopolitical conversation in capitals around the world. What does global order look like when the United States is no longer the default center of gravity? Before we go deeper into how this shift began and what triggered it, make sure you are subscribed, because what is unfolding now is not a moment. It is a transition. To understand the scale of the current realignment, the timeline does not begin today. It stretches back across years of accumulated friction, failed negotiations, and rising mistrust between Washington and its traditional partners, intensifying sharply under the presidency of Donald Trump. For decades after the Second World War, the global system was structured around a single assumption: the United States would act as the stabilizing core of international security. That assumption shaped NATO expansion, Middle East deterrence strategies, and global financial coordination. Even when disputes emerged, the underlying architecture remained intact. But the early cracks in that structure began forming when U.S. foreign policy started shifting between long-term institutional strategy and rapid, personality-driven decision-making. Those cracks widened significantly during periods of escalating global crises, from Middle Eastern maritime tensions to trade disputes and alliance disagreements. Under Trump, those tensions did not simply continue, they accelerated. Phase 1. Early realignment signals. During the initial phase of Trump's presidency, allied governments began noting increased unpredictability in U.S. diplomatic posture. Policy announcements often shifted rapidly, sometimes through public statements before formal diplomatic channels were aligned. This created uncertainty in capitals such as Paris, Berlin, and Tokyo about the long-term reliability of American commitments. Phase 2. Alliance strain and strategic hedging. As tensions deepened, European leaders, including President Emmanuel Macron, began openly discussing strategic autonomy, a term that, while diplomatic in tone, signaled a fundamental shift. Europe preparing to act independently if necessary. At the same time, China under President Xi Jinping expanded its global diplomatic footprint, strengthening ties with the Middle East, Africa, and parts of southern Europe. These moves were not abrupt power grabs, but steady expansions into spaces where American engagement appeared inconsistent or politically constrained. Phase 3. Fragmentation of unified response. The most significant turning point came when multiple global crises began overlapping: maritime security tensions, regional conflicts, and economic instability, without a unified US-led coordination framework holding them together. Instead of a single command structure, the world began to see parallel conversations forming. Europe coordinating internally, China expanding bilateral partnerships, Middle Eastern states diversifying security relationships, emerging actors like Ukraine gaining new strategic relevance through wartime innovation under President Volodymyr Zelensky. Phase 4. The post-anchor world. This is the phase now unfolding. The assumption that the United States automatically serves as the anchor of global crisis response is no longer universally accepted. Instead, countries are engaging in what analysts describe as multi-vector diplomacy, maintaining relationships with multiple power centers simultaneously rather than relying on a single dominant guarantor. In this environment, even symbolic authority matters. When institutions like the Vatican under Pope Leo XIII begin emphasizing neutrality, humanitarian focus, and distance from political coercion, it reinforces the broader pattern. Traditional authority figures are stepping back from alignment with any single geopolitical center. What makes this timeline critical is not any single decision or event, but accumulation. Each shift reinforces the next. Each alliance adjustment signals to others that adaptation is necessary, and over time, these small recalibrations create a structural transformation. By the time the current moment arrives, the question is no longer whether the system is changing, but how far that change will go before it stabilizes into a new global order. And that brings us to the breaking point itself, the moment where observation turns into visible geopolitical action. What is unfolding now is not a single coordinated decision, but a cascading sequence of geopolitical reactions, each one reinforcing the next, each one shaped by the perception that the global system is entering a new phase of uncertainty under the presidency of Donald Trump. To understand the present moment, analysts break it into three overlapping layers: diplomatic repositioning, security recalibration, and economic hedging. Layer 1. Diplomatic repositioning. According to multiple diplomatic signals described in the file, European and Middle Eastern leaders are increasing direct engagement with alternative global centers of power. President Emmanuel Macron has been linked to discussions around multinational maritime security coordination frameworks, particularly in regions of strategic trade significance. These frameworks are presented publicly as defensive and stabilizing, but structurally they represent a shift, coalition building that does not depend on automatic U.S. leadership. Simultaneously, President Xi Jinping is hosting and engaging senior officials from Europe and the Middle East in bilateral discussions that emphasize long-term stability, infrastructure cooperation, and economic integration. These meetings are framed as pragmatic, but their timing reflects a broader reassessment of global alignment. Layer 2. Security recalibration. In parallel, Ukraine under President Volodymyr Zelensky is being increasingly integrated into broader security conversations beyond its immediate conflict zone. The file describes Ukraine's expanding role in drone warfare systems, maritime security concepts, and defensive technological cooperation with multiple regions. This is significant because it signals a shift in security credibility. States are not only relying on traditional military powers, they are also considering wartime-tested innovation as a strategic asset in its own right. At the same time, NATO-aligned discussions are reportedly becoming more fragmented, with some members exploring contingency frameworks in case U.S. policy direction becomes less predictable in future cycles. Layer 3. Economic hedging. Behind the diplomatic and security layers lies a quieter but equally important process: economic diversification. financial systems, and trade partnerships are increasingly being structured to reduce dependency on any single power center. Energy routes, supply chains, and investment flows are being adjusted to account for potential volatility in U.S. policy direction. This is not a collapse. It is a redistribution of risk. Competing narratives. From Washington's perspective, these developments may be interpreted as normal multipolar evolution, an inevitable outcome of global economic growth and regional empowerment. From allied capitals, however, the interpretation is more cautious. A hedging strategy driven by uncertainty about long-term U.S. consistency. And from Beijing's strategic viewpoint, this moment represents opportunity, not confrontation. Stability becomes influence, predictability becomes leverage, and every hesitation in Western coordination opens space for alternative frameworks to expand. Unresolved intelligence gaps. Despite these developments, key uncertainties remain. Whether these diplomatic shifts are coordinated or coincidental, whether security discussions will formalize into permanent structures, whether economic diversification will accelerate into systemic decoupling, and whether U.S. policy will reassert centralized leadership or continue fluctuating. What is clear, however, is that the global system is no longer operating on a single synchronized timeline. Instead, multiple timelines are now unfolding simultaneously, each shaped by different assumptions about the future role of the United States under Trump. And that leads directly into the strategic question at the center of this crisis. What does all of this mean for global power balance going forward? The strategic significance of this unfolding shift is not rooted in any single battlefield, treaty, or announcement. It lies in something more structural: the gradual redistribution of trust in global security leadership away from the United States under President Donald Trump. At its core, global power is not only defined by military capability, it is defined by reliability, the belief that alliances will hold, that commitments will be consistent, and that coordination will remain stable under pressure. When that belief weakens, the architecture of security begins to change, even if no formal alliances are broken. Military significance. From a military standpoint, the most important shift is the emergence of parallel security frameworks. Instead of relying on a single dominant command structure traditionally associated with the United States and NATO, multiple regional and cross-regional coordination mechanisms are now being explored. These include maritime security coalitions, drone defense cooperation, and hybrid intelligence sharing networks. Under President Emmanuel Macron, European discussions around independent operational readiness reflect a long-developing concept: the ability to respond to crises without waiting for external authorization or leadership direction. Geographic and infrastructure. Importance geography remains central to this transformation. Strategic choke points such as maritime trade routes, energy corridors, and digital infrastructure hubs are increasingly being treated as shared security responsibilities rather than single superpower guarantees. In this environment, coordination with China under President Xi Jinping becomes strategically relevant not because of ideology but because of capacity. China's global infrastructure investments and diplomatic reach allow it to operate across multiple regions simultaneously, embedding influence within trade and logistics systems. Operational implications. Operationally, the most significant change is speed of decision-making. Previously, major international crises often followed a predictable pattern. Washington leads coordination, allies align, and multilateral frameworks respond in sequence. That sequence is now increasingly disrupted. In its place, multiple actors are responding independently and sometimes in parallel. Ukraine under President Volodymyr Zelensky has accelerated battlefield innovation in drone warfare and decentralized defense systems, which are now being studied and integrated into broader security thinking beyond Eastern Europe. This decentralization increases adaptability, but reduces synchronization. And in high-stakes geopolitical environments, lack of synchronization can be as consequential as lack of capability. Reshaping the strategic picture. The combined effect of these changes is a slow transition from a single anchor system to a distributed power system. In a single anchor system, one state, historically the United States, absorbs global shocks, coordinates alliances, and stabilizes crises. In a distributed system, multiple regional powers share those responsibilities, but without guaranteed cohesion between them. This shift fundamentally alters deterrence calculations. Adversaries no longer face a unified response structure. Instead, they face a network of overlapping but not always aligned actors, and that introduces uncertainty, both for allies and for competitors. Under the leadership style associated with Donald Trump, that uncertainty is amplified by perception. Rapid policy shifts, personalized diplomacy, and unpredictable messaging reduce the clarity that allies rely on when planning long-term security strategies. This is why strategic planners are paying attention not only to military deployments, but to political behavior. Because in modern geopolitics, perception itself is a force multiplier. And as this perception evolves, the question is no longer just how power is distributed, but who is still trusted to coordinate it. That question leads directly into the analysis coming from intelligence communities and strategic institutions. As this geopolitical realignment accelerates, intelligence assessments and strategic analysts are increasingly focused not on isolated events, but on the pattern forming beneath them. A pattern centered on shifting confidence in the United States under President Donald Trump as the default coordinator of global stability. According to multiple intelligence community perspectives referenced in strategic briefings, the key concern is not immediate collapse, but gradual degradation of coordination capacity. In other words, the system is not breaking in a single moment. It is losing synchronization over time. Intelligence community assessment security analysts within allied intelligence frameworks are reportedly tracking three major indicators. First, alliance responsiveness, how quickly states align during crises. Reports suggest that response alignment is becoming less uniform, with some states initiating independent consultations before multilateral coordination begins. Second, diplomatic redundancy, the increasing number of parallel negotiations occurring outside traditional U.S.-led channels. These include bilateral and regional security discussions that previously would have been centralized through Washington. Third, strategic hedging, the deliberate diversification of security and economic partnerships by medium and smaller powers seeking to reduce dependency on any single guarantor. Taken together, these indicators suggest not collapse, but fragmentation of leadership authority. Think Tank and Geopolitical Institute analysis. Major geopolitical research institutions in Europe and Asia are reportedly describing the current environment as multinodal competition, where influence is distributed across several centers rather than concentrated in one. Analysts emphasize that this does not automatically imply decline for the United States, but it does imply a transition away from automatic centrality. Within this framework, the actions of President Emmanuel Macron are often interpreted as part of Europe's long-term strategic autonomy project. This includes strengthening independent defense planning and expanding cooperation with non-Western partners where strategically beneficial. Similarly, China under President Xi Jinping is frequently assessed as pursuing stability projection, a strategy focused on positioning China as a predictable counterpart in contrast to perceived volatility elsewhere in the system. Military and security analyst perspectives. Military analysts focusing on Eastern Europe highlight Ukraine under President Volodymyr Zelensky as a case study in rapid adaptation under pressure. Ukraine's battlefield innovations in drone warfare, decentralized command structures, and real-time intelligence integration are being closely studied by multiple defense establishments. From an analytical standpoint, this represents a shift in what constitutes strategic value. Traditional power was measured in scale, troop numbers, hardware, and budget. Emerging assessments increasingly emphasize adaptability, technological agility, and network defense systems. This evolution complicates traditional alliance hierarchies because it allows smaller states to gain disproportionate strategic relevance under certain conditions. Academic and policy expert views. Policy scholars studying global order caution that the most significant risk is not confrontation between blocs, but erosion of coordination norms. When coordination norms weaken, crises become harder to contain, not because actors are more aggressive, but because they are less synchronized. Experts describe this as a coordination deficit, where multiple capable actors exist, but shared decision-making slows down or fragments under pressure. Within this context, leadership behavior becomes central. Analysts note that under highly personalized leadership styles, such as that associated with Donald Trump, diplomatic predictability becomes harder to maintain, increasing the incentive for other states to develop fallback structures. The core analytical consensus. Despite differences in interpretation, most strategic voices converge on one point: the system is moving toward redundancy. Not one center of power, but multiple overlapping centers of influence. Not one guaranteed response mechanism, but several conditional ones. Not one shared assumption of leadership, but competing expectations of who will lead and when. And in that environment, perception becomes as important as capability. Because in global politics, states do not only respond to power, they respond to confidence in that power. And that confidence, according to these assessments, is now being tested in real time. But the other side has a point. Not all analysts agree that the current shifts represent a decline in U.S. leadership under President Donald Trump. In fact, a significant body of diplomatic and strategic interpretation frames what is happening as a natural evolution of a multipolar world, not a withdrawal of American influence, but a redistribution of global responsibility. Alternative interpretation: structural multipolarity, not collapse. From this perspective, the emergence of independent coordination frameworks in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East is not a reaction to instability in Washington, but the result of long-term global economic maturation. Countries like those led by President Emmanuel Macron are not abandoning the United States, but rather increasing their capacity to act autonomously within a broader alliance system. In this view, strategic autonomy is not opposition to American leadership, it is burden sharing within a more complex international order. Similarly, China under President Xi Jinping is not necessarily filling a vacuum, but rather operating within an expanding global network where multiple powers naturally develop parallel spheres of influence as their economic weight increases. Diplomatic normalization of parallel systems. Some foreign policy scholars argue that what appears to be fragmentation is actually normalization. In earlier decades, the global system was unusually centralized due to post-war conditions. As those conditions fade, it is expected that regional powers will naturally build their own security and economic architectures. From this standpoint, Europe's evolving defense discussions, Middle Eastern diversification of partnerships, and Asia's expanding diplomatic networks are not symptoms of instability. They are signs of maturity in a distributed global system. Ukraine as a strategic innovator, not a political signal. Even Ukraine under President Volodymyr Zelensky can be interpreted differently in this framework. Rather than representing a shift away from U.S.-centered security structures, Ukraine's rising defense innovation and battlefield adaptation may be viewed as integration into a broader ecosystem of modern warfare development, one that complements rather than replaces existing alliances. From this view, Ukraine's technological contributions in drone systems and decentralized defense are strengthening collective defense knowledge across multiple allied states, including the United States. Reframing U.S. behavior under Trump. Supporters of this interpretation also challenge the assumption that unpredictability automatically equals decline. They argue that under President Donald Trump, diplomatic behavior may be deliberately transactional, designed to force allies to take greater responsibility for their own defense and economic security. In this reading, what critics call instability is reframed as strategic pressure toward burden sharing. This perspective holds that allies responding independently is not evidence of American retreat, but evidence of a system finally operating as intended, where partners are capable of acting without constant direct oversight. Counterpoint on China's role. Even China's expanding diplomatic engagement is not universally viewed as replacement leadership.